When I walked into the courtroom in my uniform, my wife chuckled, and her mother shook her head. Just a costume. She murked. The judge froze, his hand trembling as he whispered, "My God, is that really him?" Everyone turned and stared. Nobody knew who I really was until that day. I was halfway through mowing my lawn when the mailman decided to ruin my entire week, possibly my entire year, and if I'm being honest, maybe the rest of my natural life. The grass was that perfect height where you feel like a responsible homeowner instead of the guy whose yard looks like it's auditioning for a jungle documentary. And I was actually enjoying myself in that weird way men enjoy yard work. Mindless, sweaty, and blissfully free from human interaction. Then Jerry, the mailman who's been delivering bad news to this neighborhood since before I bought the place, came strolling up my driveway with this thick envelope that practically screamed, "Your life is about to get complicated," from 50 feet away. The thing had an official county seal stamped on it, the kind of thick paper that costs more per sheet than my lunch, and I swear to God it smelled like bad decisions wrapped in legal jargon and sprinkled with someone else's vindictiveness. I shut off the mower, which sputtered and died like it knew what was coming and wanted no part of it, and took the envelope from Jerry with the enthusiasm of a man accepting his own execution notice. He gave me this sympathetic look that said he'd seen enough of these envelopes in his career to know they never contained good news, lottery winnings, or invitations to fun parties. "Hang in there, Miles," he said, which is mailman code for, "I'm so sorry, buddy, but I'm just the messenger. Please don't shoot me." I nodded, gave him a half-wave that probably looked more like a surrender gesture, and stood there in my grass-stained cargo shorts staring at this legal bomb like it might explode if I opened it too fast. Case 2438B, Carter versus Carter. Right there at the top, printed in that cold, impersonal font that court documents use to make sure you know they mean business, and your feelings are completely irrelevant. Plaintiffs, Sabrina Carter and her lovely stage mom from hell, Darlene Whitmore. Defendant, yours truly, Miles Carter, apparently the villain in this story despite being the only person who'd actually contributed anything meaningful to our marriage besides drama and designer shoe collections. My first thought, and I'm not proud of this, but I'm also not sorry, was, well, at least they spelled my name right this time. Because 6 months ago when Sabrina filed for separation, the paperwork had me listed as Miles with a Y, like I was some hipster barista with a man bun and opinions about artisanal coffee beans instead of a grown man who'd spent 12 years trying to make a marriage work with a woman who thought compromise meant I did whatever she wanted while she complained about it. The lawsuit, and yeah, they were actually suing me because apparently divorce wasn't enough drama for one lifetime, claimed I was guilty of property abandonment, which was so impressively wrong that I actually had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating from heat stroke and lawnmower fumes. Property abandonment. The property in question? The house I was literally standing in front of, the house I'd built with my own 2 hands, and a construction crew I'd paid for with money from my Navy discharge settlement and years of working 16-hour days at my auto shop. The house that had my name on every single document, receipt, and mortgage payment for the last 8 years. But sure, I'd abandoned it by continuing to live in it, pay for it, and maintain it while my ex-wife moved in with her mother and started planning this legal circus. I took the envelope inside, walked past the living room that still had furniture I'd assembled myself because Sabrina always said we'd hire someone eventually, but never actually wanted to spend money on anything practical, and sat down at my kitchen table. This table, by the way, was solid oak, built by my grandfather, and had survived 3 generations of Carter family dinners, arguments, and apparently now legal warfare. I looked at the envelope, looked at the bottle of whiskey I kept in the cabinet for special occasions and terrible Thursdays, and made an executive decision that would have made my therapist proud if I actually had a therapist. I poured a generous amount of whiskey into my coffee mug, the one that said "World's Okayest Dad," even though I don't have kids, because Sabrina bought it as a joke about my parenting skills for Duke, my German Shepherd who's honestly got more common sense than most humans I know. Duke wandered into the kitchen right on cue, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor I'd refinished last spring, and gave me this look. You know the look I'm talking about. That specific dog expression that somehow communicates entire paragraphs of judgment and wisdom without a single word. His brown eyes locked onto mine with an intensity usually reserved for squirrels and the FedEx guy, and I could read his thoughts as clearly as if he'd spoken them out loud. "You married a mistake, didn't you?" I took a long sip of my whiskey-enhanced coffee, which tasted like regret and poor life choices with a hint of hazelnut creamer, and nodded at him. "Yeah, buddy," I said. "Yeah, I really did. 12 years of marriage, and this is what it had come to. Legal papers instead of love letters, lawyers instead of laughter, and a bunch of accusations instead of actual conversation." I thought about our wedding day, which feels like it happened in another lifetime to a completely different person who was significantly dumber and way more optimistic about his chances of marital happiness. Sabrina had looked beautiful in her dress that cost more than my first car, and I'd stood at that altar genuinely believing we were going to build something meaningful together. Her family had been there in force. Her mother Darlene front and center with that tight smile she always wore around me, the one that said she was tolerating my existence, but just barely. Her father had shaken my hand with the grip of a man who'd already given up fighting his wife's opinions, and her two sisters had whispered to each other throughout the ceremony in that way that made it clear they were taking bets on how long the marriage would last. I flipped through the pages of the lawsuit, each one more ridiculous than the last, filled with words like petitioner and respondent and equitable distribution, that made me feel like I was reading a foreign language designed specifically to confuse and infuriate normal people. They wanted half of everything: the house, my business, my tools, probably my internal organs if they could figure out the legal precedent. According to their lawyers' flowery language and complete disregard for actual facts, I had somehow abandoned my responsibilities as a husband, failed to provide adequate support, and demonstrated a pattern of negligence that entitled Sabrina to compensation for her suffering. Her suffering. The woman who'd spent our entire marriage complaining about my job, my house, my friends, my dog, and apparently my entire existence, while contributing exactly $0 to our household income and -$dollars to our household happiness. Duke put his head on my knee, and I scratched behind his ears the way he liked, right in that spot that made his back leg twitch like he was trying to run in his sleep. "You know what, Duke?" I said, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet kitchen where I'd eaten 1,000 meals alone while my wife was out with her friends or her mother or whoever would listen to her complain about her tragic life married to a mechanic. "This is a typical Thursday. This right here, this is exactly the kind of Thursday I should have expected when I ignored every single red flag and married into that family." Duke's tail thumped against the floor twice, which I chose to interpret as agreement and support rather than just his general excitement about ear scratches and the possibility of treats. I finished my whiskey coffee, set the mug down on top of the lawsuit like I was trying to drown it in coffee rings and bad decisions, and made another decision. If Sabrina and her mother wanted to fight, if they wanted to drag me into court and pretend I was the bad guy in this story, then fine. Game on. But they were about to learn something about Miles Carter that they'd somehow missed during 12 years of marriage and a lifetime of underestimating me. I might work with my hands. I might not have a fancy degree or a corner office, but I kept receipts. I remembered everything, and I was about to make their legal circus a whole lot more interesting than they planned. I wasn't always this calm, this collected, this perfectly content to sit in my kitchen drinking spiked coffee while reading legal documents that accused me of crimes I didn't commit. Once upon a time, back when I was young and stupid and apparently completely blind to obvious personality disorders, I actually thought marrying Sabrina was a good idea. Possibly even a great idea, if you can believe that level of delusion. I met her at a charity fundraiser for veterans that I'd only attended because my buddy from the Navy, Tommy Rodriguez, had dragged me there with promises of free food and the kind of networking opportunities that might help me get my auto shop off the ground. She was standing by the bar in a red dress that probably cost more than my rent, laughing at something her friend said, and when she turned and smiled at me, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck carrying nothing but bad judgment and poor decision-making skills. The first 6 months were great, or at least I thought they were great, which in hindsight probably says more about my low standards than her actual qualities as a human being. She laughed at my jokes, didn't seem to mind that I drove a 15-year-old pickup truck held together by duct tape and optimism, and acted like my Navy stories were interesting instead of traumatic memories I was trying to process through humor and avoidance. But then I met her family. And that's when the carnival music started playing and the red flags began forming a parade that should have sent me running in the opposite direction at maximum speed. Her mother, Darlene Whitmore, who kept her maiden name because apparently even marriage couldn't fully claim her identity or her superiority complex, took one look at me, and I could see her mentally calculating how quickly she could get her daughter to upgrade to someone more suitable. They called me the garage guy at family dinners, always with those little air quotes that people use when they want to be insulting while maintaining plausible deniability. "Oh, Sabrina's seeing the garage guy," Darlene would say to her country club friends, her tennis partners, her book club members who probably spent more time drinking wine and gossiping than actually reading books. Never a mechanic, never auto shop owner, and definitely never veteran who served his country while your son was flunking out of his third liberal arts college and discovering that his trust fund couldn't buy him a personality. Because apparently serving in the Navy for 8 years, including 2 tours in the Middle East where I saw things that still wake me up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat, and then coming home to fix engines and build an honest business didn't meet their investment banker's standards or their country club requirements for acceptable son-in-law material. Darlene used to say, and I can still hear her voice in my head like a persistent mosquito that you can't quite swat. "Miles, men who work with their hands rarely think with their heads." She'd deliver this little gem of wisdom while sipping her 3rd glass of Chardonnay at Sunday brunch, looking at me over the rim of her glass like I was a science experiment that had gone wrong and needed to be observed before being discarded. I wanted to reply. I really wanted to say, "Well, Darlene, that's one more thing your husband doesn't do with his, considering he hasn't had an original thought since 1987 and spends most of his time nodding along to whatever you say like one of those bobblehead dolls people put on their dashboards." But I stayed quiet, because I'd been raised to respect my elders even when my elders were judgmental snobs who wouldn't know hard work if it came up and introduced itself with a firm handshake and a resume. When I got discharged after an injury overseas, a lovely souvenir from an IED that left me with a titanium rod in my left leg, chronic pain that flares up whenever it rains, and enough nightmares to fill a psychiatric textbook, I took my settlement money and bought a small workshop on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a cinder block building with 3 bays, an office that doubled as a storage closet, and enough space to do what I actually loved doing, which was taking broken things and making them work again. I lived modestly, saved my money, paid my bills on time, and generally tried to build a life that made sense to me even if it didn't impress anyone at Darlene's country club. My wife called it a phase, like I was a teenager going through an emo period instead of a grown man building a business and trying to find some peace after years of chaos and violence. I called it peace, sanity, and the first time in my adult life that I actually felt like I was doing something meaningful that didn't involve explosions or funerals. Then, out of absolutely nowhere, like a tornado that forms on a clear day just to mess with meteorologists and destroy trailer parks, Sabrina filed for division of assets. Not a conversation, not a "Hey Miles, I'm unhappy and we should talk about this like adults," but full-on legal paperwork delivered by a process server who looked apologetic about his career choices. She wanted to take everything I owned and pretend she'd built it, contributed to it, earned it somehow through her years of complaining about it, and telling her friends how embarrassing it was to be married to someone who came home smelling like motor oil and honest work. According to her lawyer's initial filing, which I'd received 3 weeks before this lovely lawsuit showed up, she deserved half of my business because she'd provided emotional support and partnership during our marriage, which was such a creative interpretation of reality that it deserved some kind of award for fiction writing. Emotional support. I actually laughed out loud when I read that part, sitting in my lawyer's office while he looked uncomfortable and shuffled papers like he was trying to find a way to tell me I was screwed without actually using those words. The emotional support of telling me my job was embarrassing? The partnership of spending money I earned while complaining that I didn't earn enough? The loving encouragement of comparing me unfavorably to her friends' husbands who worked in finance and wore suits that cost more than my monthly mortgage payment? If that was emotional support, then I'd been emotionally supported right into therapy territory. Except I couldn't afford therapy because my wife had spent our savings on a series of investments that included a failed boutique, a timeshare in Florida she visited once, and enough shoes to open a store that specialized in footwear for women with more money than sense. That night, the night I got the first round of paperwork and realized my marriage was officially over in every way except the legal sense, Duke and I had a heart-to-heart in my living room. He was lying on his dog bed, the expensive orthopedic one I'd bought him because he'd started limping and I couldn't stand to see him in pain. And I was on the couch with a beer and a growing sense that my life had become a country song written by someone with a dark sense of humor and a grudge against mechanics. I looked at Duke. He looked at me with those wise brown eyes that suggested he'd been waiting for me to figure this out for years. And I said, "They want to take everything, buddy. The house, the shop, probably you if they thought they could get away with it. Even though Sabrina always said you shed too much and smelled like dog." Duke barked once, sharp and clear, and somehow I knew exactly what he meant. It was the same bark he used when he saw a squirrel in the yard and wanted me to know that justice needed to be served, that some wrongs couldn't go unpunished, that sometimes you had to stand up and fight even when the odds seemed stacked against you. I took a long drink of my beer, let the cold liquid wash away some of the anger and frustration that had been building in my chest like pressure in a boiler, and nodded at him. "You're right," I said, my voice steady for the first time in hours. "You're absolutely right. Let's burn them with kindness and paperwork. Because here's the thing about being a mechanic, about working with engines and machines and systems that have to function perfectly or they fall apart. You learn to be meticulous. You learn to keep records, document everything, save every receipt, track every expense, and never assume that something will work just because it should. I had 8 years of mortgage payments, all from my account. I had business records showing every dollar I'd earned and where it had gone. I had maintenance logs for the house, showing every repair I'd made, every upgrade I'd installed, every single improvement that had turned a decent house into a home worth fighting for. And I had something else, something that Sabrina and her mother had forgotten about, or maybe never knew in the first place. I had my military records, my service history, and a chest full of medals that told a story about who I really was when you stripped away the grease stains and the blue-collar job they loved to mock. I spent the next week organizing everything, creating files and folders and spreadsheets that would make an accountant weep with joy. Every document dated, labeled, cross-referenced, and backed up in 3 different locations because I'd learned in the Navy that redundancy wasn't just a good idea. It was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Duke supervised, lying on the floor of my home office and occasionally lifting his head to check on my progress or remind me that dinner time was approaching and his bowl was tragically empty. By the time I was done, I had a case so airtight that a lawyer would need a miracle and a time machine to poke holes in it. And I had a plan that felt like the first good decision I'd made since saying, "I do," to a woman who apparently heard, "I don't" whenever I talked about my hopes, dreams, or basic human dignity. I hadn't worn my uniform in years, and by years I mean nearly a decade of letting it sit in my old Navy chest like a relic from a past life I tried to move on from, but never quite forgotten. The chest itself was military issue, olive drab with my name stenciled on the side in letters that had faded but never disappeared completely, and it lived in the back of my bedroom closet behind boxes of tax returns and winter clothes I never wore, because this part of the country didn't get cold enough to justify actual winter gear. I'd opened it maybe twice since I got discharged, once to show Tommy a photo from our deployment days when he was feeling nostalgic and drunk, and once when I couldn't find my dog tags and thought maybe I'd left them in there, which I hadn't, because they were actually hanging on my bathroom mirror where they'd been the whole time. But that night, after spending 3 hours organizing documents and building a legal defense that would make Perry Mason proud if Perry Mason had been a pissed-off mechanic with trust issues and a German shepherd for a paralegal, I walked into my bedroom and stared at that closet like it contained either salvation or damnation, and I wasn't entirely sure which. Duke followed me, because Duke followed me everywhere like he was my furry shadow assigned by some cosmic force to make sure I didn't do anything too stupid or self-destructive, and he sat down next to me while I pulled boxes out of the way and dragged that chest into the middle of my bedroom floor. It was heavier than I remembered, or maybe I was just older and more tired than I used to be, and it hit the floor with a thud that sounded final and important, like a judge's gavel or a coffin being lowered into the ground. I sat cross-legged in front of it like I was about to open a time capsule or Pandora's box, which in a way I guess I was, and flipped the latches that had stayed locked for so long they protested with rusty squeaks that echoed in my quiet bedroom. The smell hit me first, gun oil and memories, mixed with that distinctive military scent of canvas and metal in places far from home, where young men learned hard lessons about mortality and duty and what it really meant to serve something bigger than yourself. My dress uniform was folded on top, exactly where I'd left it after my discharge ceremony, wrapped in dry cleaner plastic that had yellowed slightly with age but still protected the dark fabric underneath from dust and moths and the passage of time that turns everything into nostalgia, whether you want it to or not. I pulled it out carefully, the way you'd handle something fragile and potentially dangerous, and laid it across my bed like I was preparing a body for viewing at a funeral. The jacket still fit, or at least I hoped it still fit because I'd gained maybe 15 pounds since my Navy days, but I'd also been hitting the gym more consistently because physical pain was easier to manage than emotional pain, and lifting weights didn't judge you or ask for half your assets in divorce court. Duke jumped up on the bed, which he wasn't technically allowed to do, but I'd given up enforcing that rule about 3 years ago when I realized I was lonely enough to appreciate his company even if it meant dog hair on my comforter, and he sniffed at the uniform like he was conducting some kind of canine investigation into my past. "Well, buddy," I said, brushing dust off the shoulder boards that still gleamed with the kind of shine you only get from hours of polishing and military discipline. "Looks like you're back on duty." Duke wagged his tail in response, which I chose to interpret as enthusiastic support rather than simple excitement about being on the bed, where he could see out the window and monitor the neighborhood for suspicious squirrel activity. The jacket had 3 rows of ribbons on the chest, each one representing something I'd earned through sweat or blood or watching friends get loaded onto helicopters and body bags while I stood there wondering why I'd survived and they hadn't. There was my National Defense Service Medal, my Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, my Good Conduct Medal that seemed ironic now considering I was about to walk into court with the specific intention of destroying my ex-wife's legal arguments with extreme prejudice. And then, on the top row, there was the Silver Star, the big one, the medal that most people only saw in movies or history books, the one that came with a ceremony and a citation and a memory I'd spent 10 years trying to drink away, therapy away, work away, and generally pretend hadn't happened, even though it woke me up at 3 in the morning at least twice a month with images I couldn't unsee and sounds I couldn't unhear. I touched it gently, the way you'd touch a scar that still hurt years after the wound had healed, and remembered the day I'd earned it in excruciating detail that my brain had stored in high definition for maximum trauma recall. I ironed the jacket that night, set up my ironing board in the living room because the bedroom didn't have enough space and I needed room to work, and spent an hour getting every crease perfect and every wrinkle eliminated like I was preparing for inspection by an admiral instead of a court appearance in front of a judge who probably thought all veterans were either heroes or homeless people with nothing in between. Duke watched from the couch, his head tilted in that way dogs do when they're trying to figure out if you've lost your mind or if this is just another weird human behavior they need to tolerate. I ironed until the jacket gleamed under my living room lights, until it looked like something you'd see in a recruiting poster or a military museum display case, until it looked like it belonged to someone important instead of a mechanic with a bad marriage and a lawsuit that accused him of abandoning property he'd literally built with his own hands and money from his own bank account. The ribbons got cleaned with a soft cloth and some metal polish I had in my shop, the kind I used on chrome fixtures and fancy car parts for customers who wanted their vehicles to shine like they'd just rolled off a showroom floor. Each one got individual attention, careful polishing until they caught the light and reflected it back with the kind of brilliance that suggested they meant something, stood for something, represented sacrifices that people like Sabrina and her mother would never understand because they'd never sacrificed anything more significant than a parking spot at the mall or a table at their favorite overpriced restaurant. I pinned them back onto the jacket in precise formation, measured the spacing between each row with a ruler because military regulations didn't care that you'd been out for 10 years. They were etched into your brain like commandments handed down from on high. Sabrina used to tell people I'd done some light office work for the military at cocktail parties and family gatherings, which was such a spectacular revision of reality that it would have been funny if it wasn't so insulting to everyone who'd actually served. Light office work. Yeah, sure. If Office work means hauling survivors out of burning transport trucks in Yemen while taking small arms fire and wondering if each breath was going to be your last, then yeah, I guess I did some light office work. If it means coordinating evacuations while buildings collapsed around you and the radio kept crackling with calls for help you couldn't answer because you were already at maximum capacity for saving lives that day, then absolutely, I was basically a secretary with a rifle. She'd simplified my entire military career into something bland and unthreatening because the reality made her uncomfortable, because she didn't want to think about what I'd seen or done or survived, because it was easier to pretend I'd pushed papers in an air-conditioned office somewhere than to acknowledge that her husband had the kind of experience that left scars you couldn't see and medals you couldn't buy. I decided right there, standing in my living room at 11:30 at night with my uniform hanging perfect and pressed on a hanger hooked to my ceiling fan, that if I was going to court, I'd go in full honor, not half dignity. This wasn't about showing off or making a scene or trying to intimidate anyone with my service record like some kind of military peacock displaying feathers to attract mates or scare off predators. This was about showing up as my complete self, the version of Miles Carter that existed before Sabrina and her family spent 12 years trying to sand down my edges and make me fit into their narrow definition of acceptable manhood. Call it my version of dress code revenge, or call it finally having the courage to stop apologizing for who I was and what I'd done with my life before I made the catastrophic mistake of thinking love could bridge the gap between completely incompatible value systems. Duke barked once, sharp and approving, and I looked down at him with a smile that felt genuine for the first time in weeks. "You think the judge will appreciate the effort?" I asked him, and he wagged his tail twice, which in Duke language meant either absolutely yes or I have no idea what you're talking about, but I support you anyway, and also it's almost time for my evening treat. I gave him the treat because even in the middle of preparing for legal warfare you had to maintain some routines and make sure your dog knew he was appreciated. And then I stood there looking at that uniform hanging in my living room like a ghost from my past come back to haunt my present and maybe, just maybe, save my future from people who'd never understood me and probably never would. The courthouse smelled like old coffee and cheap perfume, mixed with that distinctive government building odor of floor wax, anxiety, and the crushed dreams of everyone who'd ever walked through those doors hoping for justice and settling for whatever the legal system felt like dispensing that particular day. I'd arrived early because the Navy had drilled punctuality into my soul so deep that being on time felt late and being early felt barely acceptable. And I sat in my truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes just breathing and trying to remember that this was just another mission, just another operation that required planning and execution and the ability to stay calm when everything around you was designed to make you panic. Duke was at home because they didn't allow emotional support animals in courtrooms unless you had official paperwork and 3 months to process the request through whatever bureaucratic nightmare handled those things. But I'd given him extra treats before I left and promised I'd be back soon with good news, or at least interesting stories. My uniform felt strange after all these years, like wearing someone else's skin or stepping into a photograph of yourself from a different lifetime when you had different priorities and fewer regrets. The jacket was a little tight across the shoulders because apparently I'd been stress eating more than I realized, and lifting weights doesn't actually make you smaller, but it still fit well enough that I didn't look like a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. The ribbons caught the morning sunlight coming through my truck window, each one a small rectangle of colored fabric that represented hours or days or months of my life that I'd never get back and wasn't entirely sure I'd survived as intact as everyone seemed to think. I checked myself in the rearview mirror one last time, adjusted my cover. That's a hat for you civilians who don't speak military, and walked toward the courthouse entrance with the kind of purposeful stride you develop after years of marching in formation and pretending you know where you're going even when you're completely lost. Security made me take off my cover and walk through the metal detector, which beeped enthusiastically because apparently my belt buckle and the titanium rod in my leg were enough to trigger concerns about national security or whatever threat courthouse security guards worried about besides their lunch breaks and retirement plans. I explained about the leg, Showed them my military ID that I still carried even though it was technically expired because some habits die hard and you never know when you might need to prove you're not just some guy playing soldier. And they waved me through with the kind of respectful nods that suggested maybe they were veterans too, or at least had family members who served and understood what the uniform meant beyond just fabric and buttons. The courtroom was on the third floor, room 314, and I took the stairs instead of the elevator because I needed to move, needed to burn off some of the nervous energy that was making my hands shake slightly and my heart pound like I was back in Yemen waiting for the next explosion instead of in a peaceful American courthouse waiting to defend myself against accusations of property abandonment. The hallway outside the courtroom was crowded with lawyers in expensive suits, defendants in various states of dress ranging from business casual to I just rolled out of bed and grabbed whatever was cleanest, and family members who looked like they'd rather be literally anywhere else on earth, including dental offices and DMV waiting rooms. Then I saw her. Sabrina strutted down the hallway like it was a fashion runway in Milan instead of a municipal courthouse in a mid-sized American city that nobody had ever heard of unless they lived here or got lost on their way to somewhere more interesting. She wore designer heels that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment, the kind of shoes that made that distinctive clicking sound on tile floors that announced her presence before she even came into view. Her outfit was all coordinated: navy blue dress, matching purse, jewelry that sparkled under the fluorescent lights like she was trying to blind the judge with sheer expense and impeccable taste. Her mother followed 3 steps behind like a presidential bodyguard or a remora following a shark, wearing her own version of courtroom couture that screamed, "I have money and opinions, and I'm not afraid to share both with anyone who'll listen." Darlene saw me first, and I watched her face go through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, recognition, disapproval, and finally something that might have been concern or might have been indigestion from whatever overpriced breakfast she'd consumed at whatever country club restaurant served people like her at 8 in the morning. She leaned towards Sabrina and whispered something, and my ex-wife turned to look at me with those green eyes that had once made me stupid enough to think love conquered all, but now just made me remember every argument, every disappointment, every moment when I'd realized I'd married someone who fundamentally didn't respect or understand me. When I walked into the courtroom wearing my full dress uniform, every ribbon in place, and every brass button polished to perfection, the whole room froze like someone had hit pause on reality. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Lawyers looked up from their legal pads. The bailiff, an older guy with a military bearing that suggested he'd probably served himself back when Vietnam was still making veterans instead of history documentaries, actually straightened up and his hand moved toward a salute before he caught himself and remembered he was in civilian territory now. The judge hadn't entered yet, but you could feel the atmosphere in the room change from routine legal proceeding to something else, something unexpected that people weren't quite sure how to process. Sabrina snorted, and I mean actually snorted like a horse or a teenage girl who'd just heard the worst joke in human history. "Oh, please," she said, loud enough for half the room to hear, and probably intending for the other half to hear too because subtlety had never been her strong suit, and she'd perfected the art of the stage whisper years ago. "It's not Halloween, Miles." Her voice had that particular tone she used when she wanted everyone around her to know she was being clever and cutting. The same tone she'd used at dinner parties when she'd make little jokes about my job or my truck or my general failure to meet her standards for acceptable husbandhood. A few people in the courtroom actually chuckled, probably assuming I was some delusional veteran trying to play the military card for sympathy points or special treatment, and I felt my jaw clench with the effort of not responding the way I wanted to respond. Her mother leaned in close, her designer perfume probably costing more per ounce than premium gasoline, and whispered something that I couldn't hear but could definitely lip read because I'd spent enough time around Darlene to recognize her greatest hits of condescension. "Just a costume," her lips formed, and she said it with such dismissive certainty that you'd think she was commenting on someone's Halloween outfit or a child playing pretend, instead of looking at a uniform that represented 8 years of service and sacrifices she couldn't begin to comprehend, because the hardest thing she'd ever done was probably choosing between vacation homes or deciding which charity gala to attend when 2 were scheduled on the same night. I smiled at them, not the fake smile I'd learned to use at family dinners when Darlene was being particularly insufferable, but a genuine smile that came from knowing something they didn't know, having information they'd overlooked, holding cards they didn't realize were in play. "Funny," I said, my voice carrying across the courtroom with the kind of projection you learn from years of shouting orders over gunfire and helicopter rotors. "This costume outranks your entire family tree." A few people in the room tried to suppress laughs, and I saw the bailiff's mouth twitch with something that might have been approval or amusement or both. Sabrina's face went red, that particular shade of crimson she turned when someone challenged her or pointed out that maybe she wasn't always right about everything. And Darlene's eyes narrowed like she was trying to decide if I'd just insulted her or if she'd misheard me. Then the bailiff called out, "All rise," in that official voice that government employees use when they want you to know they have authority and you need to respect it, and everyone in the courtroom stood up like we were in church or at a military formation. The judge walked in, a man in his early 60s with gray hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, wearing the standard black robe that made all judges look like they were either about to dispense wisdom or audition for a role in a legal drama. He settled into his chair, arranged his papers on the bench in front of him with the meticulous care of someone who'd done this thousands of times, and looked up to scan the courtroom and see who was about to waste his time with whatever domestic dispute or civil case was on the docket for this particular Tuesday morning. His eyes moved across the room in a practiced sweep, the kind of visual inspection that takes in everything and misses nothing, and then they landed on me. He froze. Actually froze, his hand stopping mid-reach for his gavel, his mouth opening slightly like he'd just seen something that defied explanation or challenged everything he thought he knew about reality. He stared at my uniform, at the ribbons on my chest, at the silver star that sat on the top row gleaming under the courtroom lights like a small beacon of credibility and service. His hand actually trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses, leaned forward to get a better look, and then whispered something that I barely heard but definitely caught. "My God, is that really him?" Sabrina's smirk, that confident expression she'd worn since we walked into the courthouse like she already knew how this was going to end, and it ended with her getting everything she wanted plus damages for emotional distress, faded faster than her Botox injections would wear off. She looked at me, then at the judge, then back at me again like she was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly grown extra pieces she didn't remember ordering. Her mother grabbed her arm, probably trying to provide support or solidarity or whatever wealthy women provide each other when things don't go according to plan, and I just stood there at attention because old habits die hard, and when a superior officer looks at you like that, you stand up straight and wait for orders even if you've been out of the military for a decade, and technically nobody outranks you anymore except maybe your conscience and your dog. Their lawyer started his performance like he was auditioning for a legal drama on basic cable, the kind of show where everyone wears expensive suits and delivers dramatic monologues while inspirational music plays in the background and justice always prevails in the last 5 minutes before commercial break. His name was Richard Thornton, though he introduced himself as R. Bradford Thornton III, because apparently 3 generations of Richards wasn't enough and they needed to add extra syllables to justify the hourly rate he probably charged for breathing in the general direction of legal documents. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than my truck, cufflinks that caught the light every time he gestured dramatically, and that particular breed of confidence that comes from winning cases against people who can't afford lawyers as expensive as he was. He talked about abandonment and irresponsibility like he was describing a serial killer instead of a guy who'd literally lived in his house and paid all the bills while his wife moved out and started planning legal warfare. According to Thornton's opening statement, which seemed designed to make me sound like a deadbeat dad, even though we didn't have kids, because Sabrina always said children would ruin her figure and interfere with her social calendar, I had systematically neglected my marital duties, failed to provide adequate emotional and financial support, and demonstrated a clear pattern of behavior that justified stripping me of assets I'd worked my entire adult life to acquire. He paced back and forth in front of the judge like a lion in a very expensive suit, gesturing with his hands to emphasize points that were apparently so important they required physical theater to fully convey. He painted a picture of Sabrina as a suffering wife who'd endured years of hardship married to a man who valued his work more than his marriage, his dog more than his family obligations, and his stubborn independence more than his responsibilities to the woman he pledged to love and cherish until death or expensive lawyers did them part. I sat there listening to this creative fiction, wondering if we were talking about the same marriage, the same woman who'd spent our entire relationship complaining about everything from my job to my friends to the way I folded laundry, because apparently there was a wrong way to fold towels, and I discovered every single one of them. He conveniently left out the part where she'd contributed exactly $0 to our household income, spent money like it grew on trees in our backyard, and treated me like an embarrassing accessory she'd accidentally purchased and couldn't return without admitting she'd made a mistake. The judge listened with that patient expression judges develop after years of hearing people lie, exaggerate, and creatively interpret reality to suit their legal strategies. He took notes occasionally, nodded when Thornton made what probably seemed like valid points if you didn't know the actual truth behind them, and generally maintained the kind of professional neutrality that made it impossible to tell if he was buying any of this performance or just waiting for it to end so he could move on to the next case on his docket and eventually go home to his own family and forget about all of us and our petty domestic disputes. When Thornton finally finished his opening statement, which felt like it lasted longer than some of my Navy deployments, he sat down next to Sabrina with the satisfied expression of someone who'd just delivered a masterpiece and expected applause, critical acclaim, and maybe an Emmy nomination for outstanding performance in a family court drama. Sabrina leaned over and whispered something to him, probably congratulating him on painting me as a villain or asking if they could add more charges like breathing too loud or having the audacity to defend myself against false accusations. Darlene sat in the row behind them looking smug, like she'd just won a tennis match at the country club or successfully returned something to Nordstrom without a receipt. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses again in that way that suggested he was about to say something important or at least something he wanted us to pay attention to, and looked directly at me. "Commander Carter," he said, and I swear to God the temperature in the courtroom dropped about 10 degrees as those two words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. "Do you have a response?" His voice was formal but not unkind, the tone of someone who'd served himself or at least respected those who had, and I watched Sabrina's face as she processed what he'd just called me. "Commander?" The word came out of her mouth like she'd just been told I was actually an alien or a time traveler or literally anyone other than the man she'd been married to for 12 years. She blinked rapidly, that thing she did when her brain was trying to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew, and turned to look at her lawyer like he might have an explanation for why the judge was using military titles instead of just calling me Miles, or the defendant, or that garage guy your client had the misfortune of marrying. The judge repeated it, slower this time, with emphasis that suggested he wanted to make sure everyone in the courtroom heard it clearly and understood the significance. "Commander Carter, do you have a response to these allegations?" He gestured toward me with one hand, inviting me to stand up and defend myself, and I rose from my chair with the kind of measured movement you learn from standing at attention for hours while officers inspect your uniform and look for any excuse to make your life more difficult than it already was. "Yes, Your Honor, I do," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that my heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat and wondered if everyone else in the courtroom could hear it too. I reached into my briefcase. Not a fancy leather lawyer briefcase, but the sturdy canvas military issue bag I'd carried for years and never saw any reason to replace, and pulled out a folder that was roughly the size of a small phone book and probably weighed about the same. Inside were receipts, tax papers, bank statements, and maintenance logs organized with the kind of obsessive attention to detail that comes from years of military paperwork and the knowledge that one missing document could mean the difference between mission success and complete disaster. "Your Honor, every mortgage payment on that property came from this account." I held up the bank statements, highlighted and tabbed, and organized so thoroughly that an accountant would weep tears of joy just looking at them. "My account. My earnings from the auto shop I built after my discharge from active duty. Not joint funds, not contributions from my wife, but money I earned by working 60-hour weeks fixing cars and trucks and trying to build something stable and lasting that could support a family if we ever decided to have one, which we didn't because my wife had other priorities that apparently didn't include children or financial contributions to our household. I walked forward and handed the documents to the bailiff, who took them with a nod and passed them up to the judge. And I saw Thornton's confident expression start to crack slightly around the edges like paint peeling off a wall that had been poorly prepared before the first coat went on. The judge flipped through the pages slowly, methodically, his eyes scanning columns of numbers and dates and transactions that told a story completely different from the one Thornton had just spent 20 minutes performing for the courtroom. These records show consistent payments over 8 years. I continued, warming up to my defense now and feeling that old military confidence kick in, the kind that comes from knowing your equipment works and your intel is solid and you're about to complete a mission that everyone said was impossible. Property taxes paid from my account. Insurance paid from my account. Every single repair, every upgrade, every improvement made to that house came from my income while my wife. I gestured towards Sabrina without actually looking at her because I'd already seen enough of her face to last me several lifetimes. Contributed to our household finances by spending money I earned and complaining that I didn't earn it fast enough or in a prestigious enough profession to satisfy her mother's country club standards. The lawyer gulped, actually gulped like a cartoon character who'd just realized the Roadrunner had tricked him into running off a cliff and gravity was about to become his biggest problem. His Adam's apple bobbed visibly, and he started shuffling through his own papers like maybe he'd missed something crucial during his preparation. Like perhaps he should have asked more questions about his client's version of events before accepting it as gospel truth and building his entire case around her carefully edited narrative of suffering and abandonment. Sabrina turned red, that deeper shade of crimson that went beyond embarrassment into pure anger territory, the color she turned when a restaurant got her order wrong, or someone cut her off in traffic, or the universe had the audacity to not arrange itself according to her preferences and expectations. She leaned toward Thornton and whispered something urgent, probably trying to come up with some explanation for why all these documents existed and showed exactly the opposite of what they'd claimed in their lawsuit. But he just held up one hand in a gesture that clearly meant, "I'm dealing with this. Please stop talking and let me try to salvage what's left of our case before it burns completely to the ground." Darlene leaned forward from her seat in the gallery, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the wooden rail in front of her like she was physically restraining herself from jumping up and interrupting these proceedings with her own testimony about how her son-in-law was clearly lying and manipulating everyone with fake documents, because surely no mechanic could be this organized or this prepared or this right about everything. Her whisper carried across the quiet courtroom like a stage whisper in a theater, meant to be overheard by everyone while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional disruption. "This isn't over." I smiled at her, not the fake polite smile I'd learned to use at family dinners, but a genuine smile that came from knowing I'd spent the last week preparing for exactly this moment, anticipating every argument they might make and building countermeasures like I was planning a military operation instead of a court case. "You're right, Mrs. Whitmore," I said, loud enough for the judge to hear, and probably loud enough to carry into the hallway where other people were waiting for their own cases to be called. "It's just getting fun." The judge looked up from the documents, removed his glasses, and cleaned them with a cloth he kept in his robe pocket, and I saw something in his expression that might have been approval or might have been the satisfaction that comes from watching someone defend themselves competently instead of just rolling over and accepting whatever the other side claimed was true. Even the bailiff, standing at attention by the door like a sentinel guarding the entrance to justice, or at least the entrance to this particular courtroom, cracked a grin that suggested he'd seen enough cases to know when someone was about to get their comeuppance, and he was here for it. The judge squinted at my documents like he was trying to read fine print in dim lighting or decode some ancient language that had been lost to history and recently rediscovered in a dusty archive somewhere. He flipped through page after page of bank statements, mortgage records, and maintenance receipts with the methodical attention of someone who'd spent decades separating truth from fiction in a job where everyone lied at least a little bit, and some people lied so much they probably believed their own stories. Then he looked up at me, really looked at me instead of just glancing in my general direction, and his eyes moved from my face to the ribbons on my chest and back again like he was solving a puzzle or confirming a suspicion that had been forming in his mind since I first walked into his courtroom, wearing a uniform most people only saw on Memorial Day parades and military funerals. Commander Carter, he said slowly, emphasizing each syllable like he was making absolutely certain everyone in the courtroom heard him correctly and understood the significance of what he was about to ask. Are you the same officer who received the Silver Star for leading the Al Huda rescue mission? His voice had changed from professional neutrality to something else, something that sounded almost like reverence, or at least deep respect mixed with curiosity and maybe a hint of disbelief that someone with that kind of service record was standing in his courtroom defending himself against property abandonment charges filed by an ex-wife who apparently didn't know or didn't care who she'd been married to for 12 years. Sabrina blinked like someone had just slapped her across the face with a cold fish or told her that everything she believed about reality was actually wrong and she needed to recalibrate her entire understanding of the universe. "Rescue what now?" she said, her voice louder than she probably intended, cutting through the courtroom silence like a knife through butter or a completely inappropriate comment through what should have been a solemn moment of recognition. She looked at me, then at the judge, then at her lawyer like maybe he could explain what was happening or at least provide some context for why everyone suddenly seemed interested in my military service instead of focusing on how I'd allegedly abandoned property and failed in my marital responsibilities. I nodded once, sharp and precise, the kind of military acknowledgement you give when a superior officer asks you a direct question and the only acceptable answer is affirmative. "Yes, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the fact that talking about Al Huda always made my chest tight and my palms sweaty and brought back memories I'd spent years trying to process through therapy that I couldn't really afford and exercise routines that left me exhausted enough to sleep without nightmares at least some of the time. "That's correct, Your Honor." The judge's voice softened in a way that judges' voices probably aren't supposed to soften in courtrooms where they're meant to maintain impartial authority and professional distance from the cases they're hearing. He leaned back in his chair, still holding my documents but no longer really looking at them, his eyes fixed on me with an expression that suggested he knew the story, had followed the news coverage, maybe even had family or friends who'd served and understood what that particular operation had meant to the people involved and the lives that had been saved through actions that most civilians would consider either heroic or insane, depending on their perspective and tolerance for extreme risk. "It was one of the bravest operations the state ever produced," the judge said, and I could hear genuine emotion in his voice beneath the professional tone he was trying to maintain. I followed the coverage at the time. 23 civilians evacuated from a hostile zone under heavy fire, with multiple casualties among the extraction team, in a timeline that military analysts said was impossible, but your unit accomplished anyway through what the reports called extraordinary courage and tactical brilliance under conditions that would break most soldiers. Suddenly, the courtroom looked less like a battlefield where I was fighting for my house and my dignity, and more like a movie premiere I hadn't auditioned for, hadn't asked to be in, and definitely didn't want to star in because I'd never been comfortable with attention or recognition for things I'd done because they needed doing and someone had to do them, and I happened to be there with the training and the responsibility and the inability to leave people behind even when staying meant probably dying alongside them. People in the gallery were murmuring to each other, probably wondering who I was and why they hadn't heard about this before and whether this changed their assessment of the case they'd been watching unfold like courtroom entertainment during their own waiting time. My wife sat there completely still, mascara starting to run slightly at the corners of her eyes even though she wasn't crying, just sitting in shocked silence while her perfectly constructed narrative about her husband the garage guy collapsed around her like a house built on sand during a hurricane. Her mouth was slightly open in that expression people get when their brain is trying to process information that contradicts everything they thought they knew, and the cognitive dissonance is so severe that their face just sort of freezes while their neurons fire desperately, trying to reconcile old beliefs with new facts. She was realizing, probably for the first time in our entire relationship, that the man she'd mocked for years, the husband she'd introduced at parties as someone who worked with cars, in that dismissive tone that suggested it was barely a step above unemployment, the person her mother had called the garage guy, with such contempt that it became a nickname in her family, had actually saved lives she'd only seen on CNN during her morning routine while sipping overpriced coffee and scrolling through social media on her phone. The man who came home smelling like motor oil and honest work had once run into burning vehicles while bullets flew overhead and explosions turned night into day, coordinating evacuations, and making split-second decisions that meant the difference between families reuniting or bodies being shipped home in flag-draped coffins. I could see her mentally reviewing every conversation we'd had about my service. Every time I tried to talk about my experiences, and she'd change the subject because it made her uncomfortable or wasn't interesting enough compared to discussing her friends' vacation plans or the latest drama at her book club that never actually read books. Every family dinner where I'd been introduced as someone who fixed cars for a living while my actual accomplishments went unmentioned because they didn't fit the image her mother wanted to project about the kind of men her daughters married. Every argument where she'd implied I wasn't ambitious enough or successful enough or impressive enough by her family's standards while my medals sat in a box in the closet gathering dust because I didn't need external validation from people who measured worth in country club memberships and vacation homes. Thornton, the three-named lawyer who'd been so confident 20 minutes ago when he was painting me as an irresponsible deadbeat, now looked like he wanted to crawl under the table and disappear into whatever law school had produced him and his expensive suit and his apparently inadequate research skills. He was frantically flipping through his files like maybe he'd missed a page that said, "Important. Client's husband is decorated war hero. Proceed with extreme caution and fact-checking," but clearly hadn't because he'd taken Sabrina's word for everything and built his case on her version of events without verifying basic facts about the person he was trying to destroy in court. Darlene had gone pale, which was impressive considering the amount of makeup she typically wore, her hands still gripping the wooden rail, but now more for support than restraint. Her daughter had spent 12 years married to someone who'd received one of the military's highest honors for valor, and she'd spent those same 12 years calling him the garage guy at her country club lunches and tennis matches, mocking his profession to her friends who'd probably never worked a day in their lives and measured success by how much their husbands earned rather than what they contributed to society or humanity or anything beyond their own bank accounts and social status. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom and snapped everyone out of whatever trance they'd fallen into while processing this information and recalibrating their understanding of who was actually on trial here and what justice might look like in a case where one side had documentation and service records and the other side had designer shoes and creative interpretations of reality. "Petition denied," the judge said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of authority and finality that meant this case was over, finished, decided without further argument or appeals or opportunities for expensive lawyers to drag things out and rack up billable hours. I gave Sabrina a small salute, nothing elaborate or theatrical, just a simple gesture that acknowledged she was still technically a person even if she was a person who'd systematically underestimated and disrespected me for our entire marriage. "Guess this costume still works," I said quietly, just loud enough for her and her lawyer and her mother to hear, and I saw her face go through several more color changes that suggested her emotional state was as unstable as her legal position had turned out to be. The courtroom started to empty, people filing out to deal with their own cases or get back to their lives that didn't involve watching a mechanic in a military uniform dismantle his ex-wife's lawsuit with receipts and service records and the kind of preparation that comes from years of military training and an obsessive attention to detail. The bailiff caught my eye as I packed up my documents and gave me a subtle nod that suggested respect or approval or maybe just appreciation for someone who'd done their homework and shown up prepared instead of hoping the judge would feel sorry for them and rule based on emotions rather than facts. Sabrina sat motionless at the plaintiff's table while her lawyer gathered his papers with the defeated energy of someone who'd just lost a case he'd thought was a guaranteed win and was probably reconsidering his career choices or at least his client screening process. Her mother had finally released her death grip on the wooden rail and was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or embarrassment. Or the dawning realization that she'd spent years mocking someone who'd accomplished more in a single day of his military service than her entire family had accomplished in their combined lifetimes of country club memberships and charitable donations made primarily for tax benefits and social recognition. I walked out of that courtroom with my head high and my uniform still pressed and perfect, past the people waiting in the hallway for their own cases to be called, past the lawyers making last-minute deals and plea bargains, past the security guards who'd made me walk through the metal detector that morning and now nodded respectfully as I passed them on my way out. The morning sun was bright after the fluorescent lighting of the courthouse interior, and I stood on the steps for a moment, just breathing fresh air that didn't smell like coffee and anxiety and legal documents, feeling lighter than I'd felt in months or maybe years. When I left the courthouse, everyone stared like they'd seen a ghost or a celebrity or maybe some bizarre combination of both that their brains couldn't quite process in the harsh morning sunlight that made everything look more real and less like the surreal courtroom drama we'd just participated in. People who'd been sitting in the gallery during my case now stood in small clusters on the courthouse steps, whispering to each other while trying not to be obvious about pointing in my direction like I was a zoo animal or a historical monument, instead of just a guy who'd successfully defended himself against a frivolous lawsuit using the revolutionary strategy of having actual documentation and telling the truth. Some of them had their phones out, probably Googling Al Huda rescue mission or Silver Star recipients, or how did I not know about this guy who apparently lives in my town and fixes cars for a living? Sabrina's lawyers suddenly found the floor fascinating, studying the courthouse steps like they contained ancient hieroglyphics or the secrets of the universe instead of just being regular concrete stairs that thousands of people walked up and down every day on their way to resolve legal disputes and argue about custody arrangements and fight over property that probably wasn't worth the legal fees they were paying to fight about it. Thornton brushed past me without making eye contact, his expensive briefcase clutched against his chest like a shield, his three-part name probably feeling less impressive now that he'd lost a case he'd thought was guaranteed money in the bank and easy billing hours for his firm. Behind him, Sabrina and her mother emerged from the courthouse entrance moving like zombies or sleepwalkers, both of them wearing sunglasses that covered half their faces in what I'm sure they thought was a dignified retreat, but really just made them look like celebrities trying to avoid paparazzi after a scandal. Outside the courthouse, a small group of reporters had gathered, probably covering multiple cases or just hanging around hoping for something newsworthy to happen in a town where most news involved city council meetings and high school football scores. When they saw me in my uniform with the crowd of people staring and whispering, their journalistic instincts kicked in like bloodhounds catching a scent, and they converged on me with cameras and microphones, and that hungry look reporters get when they smell a story that might actually be interesting instead of just another municipal bond discussion or zoning dispute. "Commander Carter, any comments?" one of them asked, shoving a microphone in my face with the aggressive politeness that journalists master after years of asking questions people don't want to answer. I looked at the microphone, at the camera recording everything I said for whatever local news broadcast would air it during the dinner hour, when people were half paying attention while eating meatloaf and complaining about their own days, and I decided that if I was going to say something it should at least be memorable and accurate instead of one of those bland politician responses that use a lot of words to say absolutely nothing. "Yeah," I said, meeting the reporter's eyes directly because the Navy had taught me that eye contact conveyed confidence and honesty even when you were exhausted or terrified or both. Never underestimate a quiet man with receipts. The reporters scribbled in their notebooks or typed on their phones, or whatever journalists do these days to record information for stories that most people would skim while scrolling through news websites during their lunch breaks. They asked follow-up questions about the case, about my military service, about whether I had any message for other veterans going through similar legal battles with ex-spouses who apparently didn't do basic research about the people they'd married. I kept my answers short and professional, refusing to trash-talk Sabrina, even though she'd spent years trash-talking me to anyone who would listen, because my mother had raised me to take the high road, even when the low road looked tempting and would feel really satisfying in the moment, but ultimately just made you look petty and vindictive. That night, back at my house that was officially and legally mine without any possibility of Sabrina's lawyers finding some creative loophole to take it away from me, Duke and I celebrated with cold pizza from the box I'd picked up on the way home because I was too tired to cook and too relieved to care that the pizza had been sitting in my truck for 20 minutes and was probably lukewarm at best. I poured myself a root beer, the good kind from the glass bottle that cost twice as much as the regular kind, but tasted infinitely better, and sat on my couch with Duke's head in my lap while we watched some mindless television show that required no emotional investment or critical thinking. I looked at the uniform hanging over the chair where I'd draped it after changing back into jeans and a t-shirt, relieved to be out of the formal attire that made me feel like I was on duty instead of relaxing in my own home with my dog and my pizza, and my complete lack of legal obligations to someone who'd never appreciated me anyway. The ribbons caught the light from the television, small rectangles of color that represented chunks of my life I'd never get back. Experiences that had shaped me into someone who kept receipts and told the truth, and didn't back down when people tried to take what belonged to him through legal intimidation and creative accusations. I thought about my old crew from the Navy, Reyes, O'Hara, Jenkins, the guys who never made it back from deployments that were supposed to be routine until they weren't, whose names were now engraved on memorials that their families visited on holidays, and whose faces I still saw sometimes in dreams or in random moments when something triggered a memory I'd been trying to file away in whatever mental storage space held traumatic experiences you couldn't quite forget or fully process. They'd have laughed at this whole situation, at the image of Miles Carter standing in court against his ex-wife, using military precision to dismantle her ego and her lawyer's arguments with nothing more than bank statements and service records and the truth delivered calmly and professionally. Reyes would have made some joke about how I'd finally found a mission worthy of my strategic planning skills, suggesting that perhaps the Navy had overtrained me for civilian life, and now I was applying counterinsurgency tactics to divorce court like some kind of legal special forces operator. O'Hara, who'd always been the quiet one until he had a few beers and then became the loudest storyteller in any room, would have wanted every detail of the courtroom scene. Would have made me recreate Sabrina's face when she realized her husband wasn't just some garage guy, but someone who'd earned medals and saved lives and had a service record that commanded respect from judges and strangers alike. Jenkins, who died 3 weeks before his discharge date in an accident that still made me angry years later because he'd survived 2 deployments and was supposed to go home to his wife and his kid and his plans for a normal civilian life that would never include explosions or violence or sleeping with one eye open, would have been proud. He'd always said I was too organized for my own good, that my obsessive record-keeping and attention to detail made me seem paranoid or obsessive-compulsive, but that someday it would pay off in ways I couldn't predict. Carter, he'd said once while we were sorting through supply inventories that nobody else wanted to deal with, you keep track of everything like you're building a case against the universe. Someday that's going to save your ass when everyone else is scrambling to prove they did what they said they did. He'd been right, in a way he'd never lived to see, in a courtroom he'd never visit, in a civilian legal battle that had nothing to do with military service except that military service had taught me the skills I needed to win it. I raised my root beer bottle toward the uniform hanging on the chair, toward the memory of guys who weren't here to celebrate with me, toward the ghost of my younger self who'd enlisted thinking he'd serve his country and come home unchanged and had learned the hard way that service changes everyone and some changes are permanent and some losses never stop hurting no matter how many years pass. Yeah, they'd be proud, I said out loud to Duke, who wagged his tail in agreement, or maybe just in response to my voice breaking the silence of the living room where we sat surrounded by evidence of my victory and my survival and my stubborn refusal to let people who'd underestimated me for years take away what I'd built through hard work and sacrifice. Duke licked my hand, which was his way of saying he was proud too, or that he loved me unconditionally regardless of my legal victories or military service, or possibly just that he wanted another piece of pizza crust and was willing to provide emotional support in exchange for food. The television played some show about people renovating houses or cooking elaborate meals or surviving on desert islands. I wasn't really paying attention because my mind was still processing everything that had happened in the last 12 hours, from waking up nervous about court to standing in front of a judge to watching my ex-wife's case collapse under the weight of actual evidence and documented truth. I'd worn my uniform for the first time in a decade, revealed parts of my past I usually kept private because they were complicated and painful and didn't fit easily into casual conversations at parties or small talk with customers at my shop. And I'd won not just a legal case, but something bigger and harder to define. I'd proven to myself that the man I'd been in uniform and the man I'd become afterward weren't completely different people, that the skills and values and discipline I'd learned in the Navy hadn't disappeared just because I wasn't active duty anymore. That being quiet and modest about your accomplishments didn't mean you had to let people walk all over you or rewrite your history to suit their narratives. The garage guy had turned out to be a commander, the mechanic had turned out to be a decorated veteran, and the husband who'd allegedly abandoned his responsibilities had turned out to be the only person in the marriage who'd actually kept receipts and told the truth and built something worth protecting. Duke fell asleep with his head still in my lap, snoring softly in that way dogs do when they're completely content and trusting that the world is safe and their human will protect them from any threats that might appear. I finished my root beer, turned off the television because nothing on it was as interesting as my own thoughts anyway, and sat in the quiet darkness of my living room with my dog and my pizza box and my complete freedom from a marriage that had never been what I'd hoped it would be when I stood at that altar 12 years ago promising forever to someone who apparently didn't mean it the same way I did. 2 days later, I was elbow deep in the engine of a 1987 Chevy Silverado that belonged to old man Henderson, who'd been bringing his truck to my shop for the last 6 years because he said I was the only mechanic in town who didn't try to upsell him on repairs he didn't need or treat him like an idiot just because he was 73 and didn't know the difference between a carburetor and a catalytic converter. The radio in my shop was playing classic rock, something by Lynyrd Skynyrd that made working on engines feel almost meditative. And I was focused on replacing a timing belt that should have been replaced about 20,000 miles ago when I heard footsteps on the concrete floor and looked up to see Sabrina leaning against the doorframe of the bay like she was posing for a photo shoot instead of visiting her ex-husband's grimy auto shop that she'd always refused to visit during our marriage because she said it was depressing and smelled like failure mixed with motor oil. She was wearing sunglasses even though she was indoors, and the lighting in my shop was fluorescent and industrial rather than bright sunshine. Those oversized designer frames that covered half her face and probably cost more than the timing belt I was installing. Her outfit was casual by her standards. Jeans that probably had a designer label sewn into the pocket, a white blouse that looked like it required dry cleaning and careful handling, shoes that were definitely not appropriate for an auto shop floor covered in oil stains and metal shavings, and the general debris that accumulates when you spend your days taking things apart and putting them back together. She looked tired, or maybe hungover, or maybe just exhausted from the hangover of humiliation that comes from having your entire narrative about your life and your marriage demolished in public by a man you'd spent years underestimating and dismissing as unambitious. "You didn't have to embarrass me," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of wounded pride mixed with accusation that suggested somehow I was the villain in this story instead of the guy who'd been sued for allegedly abandoning property he actually owned and maintained while she'd been living rent-free in her mother's guest house planning legal strategies with expensive lawyers who apparently didn't believe in fact-checking. She said it like showing up to court with documentation and telling the truth was some kind of betrayal rather than basic legal defense, like I should have just rolled over and let her take everything, because that would have been more polite